We've cut them some slack as they've grappled to understand and come to grips with this coronavirus pandemic, but it's clear now that many of our state governments have failed to learn, they've failed to take a national approach, they've failed to listen to experts, they've ignored their own constituents, they've become drunk on their own power, and they've imposed unreasonable rules and regulations. They're out of control, deliberately stifling society, constricting business, killing jobs and disrupting lives, and relying on the federal government, of course, to pay for it all. And they expect popular support for keeping their publics safe. The Labor premiers of Victoria and Queensland are exposed as heartless and incompetent. They're doing more harm than good. Let me start with Daniel Andrews before we go to Queensland. Let me start with his unscientific, unnecessary and unreasonable curfew. He's locking Melburnians in their own homes every night for 3 months, and he's done it under false pretences, despite the Premier telling everyone for months that he had no alternative. His tough measures were all based on medical advice. We showed you on Tuesday that his chief medical officer said he'd never recommended a curfew and wasn't sure of its usefulness. So there was no medical advice to impose a curfew, and yesterday Andrews said the curfew was imposed to make it easier for police to enforce the lockdown rules. But we learned today that the police didn't recommend the curfew either.
Were police consulted about the introduction of a curfew?
No.
Were you at no stage?
No. The reality is I was never consulted. I've made inquiries to determine if anyone within the organisation was briefed on the matter, and as best as I can work out, our policy area was provided a copy of the proposed guidelines for our information a couple of hours before they were signed off.
Not the police's call. They weren't even consulted. So Melburnians are locked in their homes every night for 3 months, and there was no medical advice or police advice to do this. Then what went on? What process occurred? Whose idea was it to do this to Australia's second largest city?
Decisions are made by groups of people, and I can't necessarily pinpoint for you the exact individual and the exact moment that it was suggested that we put a curfew on. And what I'm saying to you is anyone who is displeased with that or doesn't think that's a proportionate measure, well, that's a decision that I've made. All these decisions are ultimately decisions that the government has made, and as the leader of the government, I'll be accountable for that.
He doesn't remember. Give me a break. This is perhaps the most undemocratic, authoritarian, extreme, un-Australian and disturbing example of government overreach I've ever heard of in this country. This Premier has put his people under an unprecedented and draconian curfew without any medical or law enforcement advice. There's zero evidence it was necessary and zero evidence it was properly considered. I find it hard to believe that Andrews' own cabinet and his own Labor MPs are prepared to accept this. The people of Victoria are being treated as absolute mugs or worse, and there is zero transparency or accountability. Andrews talks gibberish every day at these press conferences about numbers and rules, but can't explain his own actions. And all the while, on the streets of Melbourne, they're either abandoned or they're hosting ugly scenes like this when a pregnant woman is admonished for daring to sit in a park.
So I'm pregnant and obviously my exercise is limited. Like, I don't know if because I have to walk, I'm now puffed out because I'm 38 weeks pregnant.
I understand.
So even I can't sit in a park. Is that right?
You can only be out for one of the 4 reasons.
I guess that's marginally better than a pregnant woman being handcuffed at home for posting something on Facebook.
What on earth? Excuse me, what on earth?
Just put your phone down.
Can you, like, record this? I'm in my pyjamas.
What's this?
I had an ultrasound in an hour.
Yeah, she's pregnant.
Look, it's a disgrace that the Andrews government is putting police in this position, imposing so many over-the-top rules that the trust between citizens and police will be compromised. It's so severe that one of the nation's most senior businessmen, a man who happens to run CSL, the company that will manufacture any coronavirus vaccine that is made in Australia, well, he's spoken out in very strong terms. Brian McNamee says the Victorian response is disproportionate to the medical challenge. He notes that the Premier says his opinion won't change because of anger, but says the truth of the matter is that the Premier doesn't understand the severity of what's occurring, both in the economy and also in the human consequences. I don't know anyone who supports this plan, says McNamee. Victoria is an absolute outlier internationally. It is the most crushing policy in a sophisticated modern country with a dynamic city like Melbourne. Spot on, Brian McNamee. His view carries enormous weight because he's highly respected. The Premier of Victoria is suffocating his state. Now, up in Queensland, the pandemic numbers are nowhere near as bad as Victoria, but the heartlessness and the overbearing government approach is just as over the top and unreasonable. By now, you would have heard about the plight of 26-year-old Sarah Caisip, who lives in the ACT and was denied an exemption to go to Queensland and visit her dying dad. He died last week, and now she's stuck in a quarantine hotel in Brisbane waiting to see family. She wanted an exemption today to be allowed to attend his funeral, but it was denied. Here's how Sarah's plight played out in the Queensland Parliament this morning, taken up by the opposition leader, Deb Frecklington.
I table a letter that Sarah sent to the Premier on Tuesday this week after her request for an exemption to go to her dad's funeral today was denied, and I quote, "My dad is dead and you made me fight to see him, but it was too late, and now you won't let me go to his funeral or see my devastated 11-year-old sister. Will the Premier now order Sarah's matter to be urgently investigated?"
I call the Premier.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as I said very clearly, it's a matter for the Chief Health Officer. The Chief Health Officer has all the details and the Chief Health Officer makes the decision, Mr Speaker. I made it very clear, Mr Speaker, these are awful times that everyone has to go through. Every single person, Mr Speaker.
How cold, how heartless, how unnecessary. There is no COVID in the ACT. Let the woman go to her dad's funeral. Queensland has just let hundreds of officials from the AFL into Queensland with their families and also let in Tom Hanks and other celebrities. The hypocrisy, the disdain for mainstream people shown by this Premier is unfathomable. Even the Prime Minister was astonished and he took up the case with Palaszczuk, talking about it emotionally on the radio afterwards.
This is her last opportunity to say farewell to her dad. Now, all of us who have been through that process know how important a day like today is. It's still fresh in my mind. It was Father's Day on the weekend, and I'm just thinking of Sarah had to go through that day in a hotel in isolation, and there she is today.
But the Queensland Premier incredibly stuck by her guns and claimed victim status herself.
I will not be bullied, nor will I be intimidated.
Order.
By the Prime Minister of this country, who contacted me this morning.
When someone like the Prime Minister of Australia appeals to you as Premier, to your leadership, for compassion, that's not bullying. What bullying is not allowing Sarah to go with her sister to say their final goodbyes to their father.
What sort of a show are they running in Queensland? Anastasia Palaszczuk wants everyone up there for the AFL Grand Final, but is happy to stop people getting to hospital, seeing sick relatives, or even attending their dad's funeral. In the end, in a terribly sad outcome, there was a concession. Sarah was not allowed to attend the funeral, but was taken to a private viewing of her father's body. What a sickening episode. This was supposed to save face for the government, I suppose, this concession, and then the Chief Medical Officer defended the decision.
I have always been very, very, very careful in making sure that anyone at a high risk of having COVID-19 does not attend a funeral. So that those are people who come from hotspots, interstate, or of course anyone who comes from overseas.
High risk? Say what? The ACT has not had a COVID case for nearly 2 months. This woman had more chance of getting COVID at the funeral than giving it. Instead, she got to say farewell privately, as if that's what funerals are about, as if they're not about family and friends, shared grief, shared memories, shared respect and dignity. Now here, on the nighttime programs at Sky News, we've been highlighting these border cases, this unfairness, these out-of-control state governments for weeks. At least now, partly because of this case, the rest of the media is starting to pay attention. The state governments are destroying people, crushing society and killing our economy with zealous overreactions to the coronavirus. We've had reports today that the original pandemic modelling used by Australian governments was wrong by a factor of 4. The errors have been called out by experts from the James Cook University in Queensland. Modelling remains highly contentious, yet so much has been based on catastrophic scenarios that have not unfolded anywhere, let alone in Australia. Listen to this Nobel laureate.
Epidemiology and modelling has been a disgrace. They have not looked at the data. They have been wrong at every turn. We're going to see that although coronavirus is a different disease, the net impact of death is going to be very similar to severe flu. And it's going to be that way without lockdown.
Yep, the alarmists have been too noisy for too long. Now that we know more about the disease, treatments are improving and mortality rates are falling, we ought to be more realistic. Instead of debating science, debating modelling and debating policy responses, we live in a country where one premier imposes a curfew on his people on a whim with no medical or police imprimatur, and another premier forces a woman to miss her father's funeral for no good reason. Australia deserves much, much better than this, and soon people will be demanding it. In the US,